Good morning, good evening, good day, greetings and salutations. I would also add in a big welcome to the Safe Room featuring Security SideQuest. My name is Tristan Watty, and I have a legendary aura farmer himself that's also mysterious while he builds that aura. Russ, how's it going?
The aura.
The
Doing really
aura.
well. How are you doing this fine Monday?
I'm doing peachy keen, some may say. Right? I think that's the appropriate wordage, verbiage, or anything in between that. Uh, so, uh, to give a little background for you first time joiners. So, Tristan Watty, I am with AWS Professional Services, where we help customers accelerate to the cloud in a secure manner. And Russ, where are you coming from?
I am from the customer incident response team, and I hope I don't have to see you.
Yes, that is always our goal. So you don't have to see Russ, and there's a reason why, which we'll get to. Stay tuned. No spoilers, or just a couple of them. But today we have
Breadcrumbs.
another fun.
Breadcrumbs.
Yeah, just breadcrumbs, sprinkles, little aura trails, depending on how you want to look at it. So as we begin our banter, as we talk, we always like to hear where are people dialing in from? Where's everybody from? Where's everybody tuning in, viewing, listening? Uh, if you have a Walkman that you record our show and listening back to yours, we would like to hear from you in the chat.
Yeah, we really would.
Yeah, right. We have questions. They're off the grid completely. They just have a Walkman. It's like no. But the second piece or question while you're filling in where you're dialing in from is a fun one, and that stems from what is your favorite gaming console? Russ, you have the floor.
It's a contentious question. But for me, my personal favorite gaming console would be the PS3. I just think that became a bit of a classic. That was where probably some of my all-time favorite games are from. I know that people are gonna yell at me for that one, but I missed out on like the Super Nintendo era. My family went PlayStation, so that's what I got.
He jumped right into it. It's just like, we'll just go on PlayStation route. Yep. So it's funny because you mentioned that. If I had to think back, there's different periods of time, and I would have three answers to this. One would be PlayStation 2, right? Just because it has so many games and I can go down the rabbit hole with that. But I would also put Dreamcast up there. $9,999. If you remember that, then I would say take it easy when you get out of bed in the morning because your knees probably hurt and your back. But thank you. And we have Hart said, game coming, but cheats are too commonplace nowadays. I would say that is an interesting topic. And I feel like we could dig into a side quest at one point on that. That'd be interesting. Some of the security ramifications with cheating and security. But we have to get on with the show, and we digress a little bit. So today, Russ, what are we talking about?
Today we're going to go into advanced IAM. So last week we went into a little bit of an introduction of IAM. We discussed some identity management, authentication methods, and some customer stories. But you don't need to have watched our previous episode to understand what's going on with the advanced episode. So if you're one of those types of people that likes to skip the intro and get right to the meat and potatoes, not calling anyone out, myself, then you'll still be able to follow along. It's okay if you missed it.
Yeah, you can work backwards from the playlist, right? If you're the type to start at the end of the trilogy and then work your way to the first one, yeah, you're welcome. So I think with that, I think we need to start off and kind of bridging the gaps because we started off with kind of like a Legend of Zelda, and we're talking about aura farming, which goes towards a couple of, recent shows, let's say. So if we bring up our first poll to kick us off, let us do this. What IAM dungeon is your current challenge? And this is an interesting one because there's a couple of items here on the list, which I kind of like and kind of have a lot of feelings towards. I'm looking at you, Water Dungeon, but Russ, which one for you?
So this is going to be a tough one. I think Shadow Dungeon, for me, probably my challenge, making sure that you're going back and actually auditing, looking through, and we'll get into some of that later. But I think right now, that's what I think.
Okay.
Is the biggest challenge facing not just, I guess, myself, but customers I see in the industry at large.
Yeah. And I would say also feel free to put the numbers in the chat, 1, 2, 3, or 4, depending on where you're coming in from. So we also see. But I'm going to skip over Water Dungeon. I know cross account access is very important, but Water Dungeon is in front of it. So I have to go with the Lost Woods. Just because when you think of permission complexity, oftentimes that is what leads to not least privilege. Because how complex you make your privileges depends on what your overall IAM, what your overall security strategy is. So I would go with number 1. And as those start to come in and as we start to see, feel free to continue to put on the numbers. But I think this also sets us up for today's episode a little bit, because what we want to talk about is what are the advanced IAM concepts that we want to get to, that we want to view, that we want to see, and what else comes in the form of IAM, authentication, challenges, strategy, all these words that you could use singly or together in a sentence. But mainly what we want to get to is thinking about what are the nuanced capabilities of AWS IAM to turn your, let's say, your current IAM strategy into your long-term defense in depth strategy. What do I mean by that? Well, stay tuned, because we'll also get to know about authentication and the different methods, identity federation, SAML. What is it? How can we integrate with it? What are common enterprise challenges? All those different items. But the one thing we also want to talk about is what is the real world implementation strategy? Because that is a key component when you're talking about identity. And as you start to think about identity within your organization based on your target state security strategy, how do we put the plan into practice? There's a couple of tools which we'll touch upon. But first, I talked about a couple of different items, right, that are very complex, that you can go down a couple of different areas with, and it's easy to get lost. So we all know it's dangerous to go alone. So take a friend, a sage, or someone who has a larger aura than you that has been farming it, especially from an identity perspective. Because you may ask, aura farming identity? That is the question. How do I build this aura? Well, we just have the proper person, the proper guest to bring on the stage today. And that person is Phani. Welcome back to the stage of security. How's it going?
Good to be back. Good to be back in the safe room. It's my safe place.
Yes, that's good to hear. And for you first-time joiners who may not know Phani, where are you coming in from?
I'm coming in from Austin, Texas. My background is solution architecture and security and identity. So I love identity. I could talk about it for weeks, but maybe we'll see a little bit of that today.
Yeah, and I know we could talk about identity for weeks, but favorite gaming console. We have to get to that burning question that the audience needs to know.
The big one.
I could talk about this for weeks too, but I'll keep it short. I started on the Nintendo, but I have a lot of memories on the Sega Genesis, Game Boy Color emulation, if you know what I'm talking about, and PS2 and PS5 in the latest generation of consoles. But nowadays it's all about the AWS console. So that's where I'm playing most of my games today.
I wanted to see an achievement unlocked. Just pop up after mentioning that, right? So this is why we bring in the aura farm. You saw a perfect opportunity and came in with the proper aura. See, it's a sign that we're going to have a fun episode today. So if we stick along those same lines of farming aura, what IAM task are you thinking about? Are you grinding today from that perspective?
Definitely more of that lost woods. I think permission complexity, as you talked about a little bit before, that's what I'm seeing too. Right, can get pretty complex pretty fast. So
Yeah,
keep that in
yeah,
mind.
definitely. And I would say from your experience, how much of the time is it going back through those permissions and just saying, "Hey, we can make this a little bit simpler. We can kind of instead of let's say allowing, denying, or denying and allowing things of that nature, right?" What is the percentages you see?
More than half, more than time spent on actually saying, "Hey, what do I need?" From the get go. More time spent on coming back and correcting things rather than trying to fix things from the get go. But we have a lot of tools that help in that. So we understand the challenge. So we'll talk about some of that later today and how you can reduce some of that effort.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the key aspects, right? Is oh, we'll come back to it. We'll figure it out later. We have to get this up now. And with that train of thought always comes back that later happens. And usually it's just like, how do we fix this? And I think part of that conversation is talking about, let's say, authentication methods and federation and things of that nature. If you would agree on that, Fanny.
Absolutely. There's a lot of topics in the space, but the theme, as I see, even though there's a lot of topics and things to understand, it's about trying to simplify, try to keep things simple. That'll probably aid more in improving your security posture rather than trying to say, "Hey, I need all of these things to get security." No, try to keep it simple. Try to really think about what you need, and that's usually a really good strategy.
Yeah. So when you're thinking of, let's say, authentication, which is process of verifying the identity of a user or a service, right? What's a person? What's a machine? Figuring out the roles, and then it goes into the federation talk of, okay, are we using SAML? How are we connected it? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it goes back to kind of that simplification theme. I know we're talking about advancement, but really, as you get more advanced, you really want to kind of also have simple themes to get a hold of the advanced complexity. And for this, I would recommend having a centralized identity provider. I've talked about this time in the previous shows, but it really kind of helps to have one place where you can have your users, where you can have your permissions, and then you can have downstream systems that can also use that information. But try to keep it in a centralized place. That will help you set up federation. That'll help you simplify governance. That'll help you remediate anything if you need to come back. So I would say the strong recommendation is to go with a centralized identity provider. We have a solution if you want a multi-account one called Identity Center, but there's a lot of other flavors in the market as well.
Yeah. And since we're on the advanced topics of integrations and things of that nature, where do you usually start when you're thinking of, okay, we have to look at a enterprise level solution, let's say, and I like to use the quotation marks, right? But it's starting out with the basics and then growing from there. So when you're thinking of that centralized identity piece, where does your brain go first?
A couple of places. One is what does your organizational footprint look like? In AWS, you'll combine all your accounts, AWS accounts, into different units, organizational units, and you can have a single place to manage all these. So you'll definitely need to think about how many AWS accounts, what resources do you want to use from like the resource level, but then from the identity level, you want to think about who's going to use this and what do those look like in terms of groups? What do those roles and personas look like? And this typically falls in line with how you would think about roles at a company. You might say, hey, developers need certain access, whereas executives might need different access, whereas business analysts might need different access. So thinking about it in terms of roles and personas, and then also the resources you want to ask helps kind of bring those two things together.
And I would say to Russ, how much have you seen on the response side when it comes to how organizations are set up with different identity providers or trying to centralize or not having to centralize? What are you seeing from your side?
Yeah, so I mean, we do see a little bit of everything, but it's significantly more so the accounts that don't have, you know, some of the more basic protections. Like you were saying, it can be very simple to get the basics down, but they can also be some of most overlooked or most underutilized?
Like MFA, pretty
Like
simple,
MFA.
but very powerful.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's funny because it starts to go down the, let's say, the config route of the notifications when you start to think of MFA on delete, when you think of like S3 or something along those lines, and it's like, oh, we don't want to enable that because that might break something. But you know, we might want to, because it might break something if it's not enabled, because somebody will have access to, you know, shut it off or whatever the case may be. And that goes into permissioning and stuff like that.
You know, I do see a lot of similar things like that. So we see a lot of access key exposure, and there's a lot of pushback on that, because they're like, well, if we rotate these access keys, production's going to go down. You know, production's going to go down because the access key was exposed publicly. So, you know, it is tough, and sometimes it's a bit of a balancing act to get the, you know, what works best for your environment and your architecture.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I always like to kind of beat the drum of what is your target state security strategy for your organization, because all those things, all those pieces come into play, because then you'll have identity section, and inside the identity section says X, Y, and Z. And you start to have, okay, do we have preventative, detective, responsive? Like, what controls do we have in place? Especially when it comes back around to identity, because I say identity a lot and least privilege a lot. I'm trying to communicate to the other side of the interwebs, because it's such an important concept, right? Of least privilege. Let's say, oh, if I have multi-account permissions, how are they set up across AWS organizations? Let's say fine grained permissions, all those good topics, as well as saying hello again and automod and into a wall. I see some of the comments. Thank you for commenting in. I think another place to go is when we talk about authorization, right? Or authentication, I would say. What are some of the things from like a visualization standpoint that helps to get that point across? I know we can say it a couple of times, but how do we make this real? And I would pose that to Phani.
Yeah, we have a few different places where we can kind of show you quickly in our IAM dashboards to see what is the scope of your identity footprint. So definitely look at identity and access management. And there's also a service that I'll show later in the show, talks about identity and access management access analyzer, and this will show you who's using services, if they're not using services, what resource, what identity policies are unused, and also who's using your AWS account resources from outside of your AWS account. This is a great place to kind of quickly just see a list. In the security world, a lot of it is list based. There's also services that can combine everything for you into a single pane of glass, like Security Hub. But starting at any of the dashboards, starting at Access Analyzer, will quickly show you kind of what is the scope of your identity footprint, and you can kind of start to work down from there. Do you have a lot of groups? Do you have a lot of policies? Do you have a lot of users? Why do you have a lot of single users? And
Yeah.
should they have access keys?
Yeah. Should the access keys be in the S3 buckets? No, they shouldn't be.
Absolutely not.
No. I'm not speaking from any place of remembrance or something like that, but I digress. So going back to what you were saying before, so Identity Center, how does that fit into the picture, right?
Yeah, if you maybe just to kind of take back into a little bit of history, if when back 10 years ago, if you wanted to use AWS, you would sign up for an AWS account, and you get some credentials with it. The first credentials that you get with the account is called root credentials. You still get those today, but then you are responsible for setting up a user, and you log in with a username and password. And then people quickly realize, oh, well, an AWS account is not enough for me. I need more. I need like 5. I need like 10. I need a logging, a security account. I need to split up my customers. And now you've got 50, 30, hundreds, thousands of AWS accounts where you have to manage a username and password. And as we talked about earlier today, why have thousands of usernames and passwords? That's just going to make your life a lot harder. So then that's when AWS SSO, that's what it was previously known as, single sign-on, but now Identity Center allows you to use a single authentication login to access all of your AWS accounts in the same AWS organization. So commonly, people will put all of their users and groups into Identity Center, and then you get a single URL based on your permission. You see the AWS account that you can access with the role. You pick it, and then you get in. So you no longer have to care about usernames and passwords. This could be offloaded to your identity provider, or something like a Google Workspace or an Entra ID, which are also very common. Okta. These are very common.
Yeah, and I would also add to that is what we see organizations start to kind of brush up against is some of the limitations because of the way they're implementing certain items, right? When you think of, all right, let us just have this many user accounts, right? And how do we manage that? Or can we even do this? Or, oh, let's put in service control policies on top of that. And then what do you run into is the limitations of different items and how you implement and how you integrate, things of that nature. So those are all different aspects that you have to take into consideration, especially when you're thinking of least privilege and how to manage it and what is the best approach for your organization. Because then you start to get down the route of, okay, I have, let's say, roles or identities. Now, policies and procedures, how do we kind of tailor that down? So with that in mind, what approach do we take from a policy perspective, Phani?
There's again, least privilege, simple is better. So if you can try to really think about what you're going to use for your AWS accounts, which resources you're going to use, and who's going to access them up front, that will help a lot better in planning which types of controls and policies that you need. Having said that, there's a lot of controls and policies that you can use. There's also this concept of defense in depth. You can layer in different layers of defense and security, and that provides you greater security and posture rather than just a single layer. So you can add identity and access management policies that govern your identities and access management resources like users and groups. You can add service control policies. These are more at the organizational level, and they can act as really far and wide-reaching preventative controls for what services you use, what can people do. We've also introduced resource control policies and declarative policies recently, which all in combination allow you to really kind of layer in different layers of security for policy. So you can layer in a layer of defense at the organizational level. You can have some controls at the account level. You can have some controls at the identity level. And ultimately, you can also have controls at the resource level, like the S3 bucket or the VPC. And these all kind of combine to say, do you have the right access at the right time to do what you need? So we have a lot of things in place. Some of these you can just get out of the box by simply clicking around and using different services. But as you get into the more advanced stages, you want to think about how do these all play together to build in like a robust defense strategy.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head with that robust defense in depth, because if anybody looks at the IAM diagram, there are so many pieces to it, and these are there is a lot that you have to consider with that on how you're implementing different things, right? So the RCPs that were introduced, I know a lot of people went crazy for that. Were like, oh, we need this now. How do we do this? And part of that is trying to look at your whole estate to kind of start off with, because if you start implementing items without kind of a goal in mind, that's how you go back to that. Oh, let's just add it in and think about it later, right? And that's where you start to see people like Russ pop up and say, hey, there's something got through. Well, why? Well, yeah. So those are all different pieces to consider. So
I will throw in one last another curveball finally. What you will see, I think one of the complex scenarios that you might run into is different services might have different authentication mechanisms. So we're in a world where you have a lot of different services that are in use. A lot of it might be in AWS, but you might be reaching out to third parties. You might be reaching out to other APIs outside of AWS. You might also be using third-party services inside of AWS that require their own authentication layer, like OpenSearch, for example, or QuickSight, for example. They don't require it, but you can have their own authentication mechanism. So this is another thing to keep in mind, that it can get pretty complex. Someone can just say, hey, I want to use QuickSight, and they go around and they start using it, put in all their users, but they might not collaborate with their identity or security team. So again, just kind of re-emphasizing one last time, it's extremely crucial to kind of understand what you want to use and how you want to use it up front, and at least have some sense of that, and collaborate with your security teams, collaborate with your identity teams. If you don't have them, reach out to us, reach out to Russ, reach out to Tristan, myself. We'd be more than happy to help you with this stuff.
Yeah, just reach out to Russ first, though. Point everybody towards Russ.
That's
Reach
what I
out to Russ first.
Reach out to Russ first.
Yeah, just reach out to Russ. So after the show, just send Russ a LinkedIn comment to say, "Hey, I'm just reaching out." Right?
Commenting for better reach.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah. So Russ, what are your thoughts on the topic?
You know, I don't think I have a lot of thoughts. I think I've got a lot of complaints. You know, from my end, I see what happens when things go wrong. You know, and try to get them back to baseline. But for the most part, yeah, I think that now would be a good time for people to go like and subscribe us on our different social media platforms: Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, where you can find our old recordings of our episodes as well.
Yes, definitely. And that is a couple of different comments. Is where can I find the different items? Those are some places where you can find. And actually, you can follow on the Twitch. You see some previous shows. And then you also have some of our previous shows on LinkedIn and YouTube. So a couple different places. And we're working on updating the community.aws as well. So, but thank you for jumping in and also answering and asking questions. Are we going to provide a better confused deputy protection? That'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about. Because I know there's a couple of pieces that you could put into play where we have the different policies and things of that nature where you can say, hey, this is org specific, or this goes towards principal, or this goes towards like the resource control policies. These are all steps and pieces of the puzzle that you want to implement, right? So I think that's a lot of ways that you can start to build out your overall strategy when it comes to IAM and trying to avoid that confused deputy piece. But what are your gents' thoughts on that?
I'm seeing a lot of what's called like zero trust access, right? Like, so try to, again, it goes back, it's zero trust, but it's also defense in depth. We lock down pretty much every endpoint. If I'm building an architecture right now, if your network is a resource, we'll lock that down with the VPC endpoint. If you have an S3 bucket, we'll lock that down with a gateway endpoint. We also have other services that will give you just-in-time access. Security token service already does that natively on AWS, but there's other services that you can add, like verified permissions and verified access, that can give you just-in-time access to make sure that you're getting the right access at the right time and it's being validated every single time. Having said that, there's a lot of tooling built in to alert when something goes wrong, when something is not intended. I would definitely make a plug for our Amazon Guard Duty service that can automatically detect from your logs if some malicious activity is happening. I see this all the time. Maybe Russ sees this as well. I'm sure he can attest to it, where we see maybe a username is trying to be brute forced. Their password, maybe a username is trying to be used in a different way than it typically is. But this is this might also help with some of that as well.
Yep. And I think a part to jump in is just figuring out, and we have another. How do you explain that to the developer who is not focused on AWS? The experience of developers is that they are forced to learn an arcane trust policy element that might or might not break things. And I would say thank you for that comment, because that goes to your overall approach of how do you handle not just identity within your organization, but your data protection, your network security, all those different components, because you put in place guardrails that help the developer to build without necessarily slowing down the developers themselves. So that goes to everything Phani was talking about and Russ was talking about of okay, how do you set up boundaries within your organization? And we'll touch upon a couple of different ways that we can delve into it, but is a larger conversation to be had. So thank you for that comment as well. And what we want to jump into is hearing from the audience in the form of a poll. Because if we were to take this as a game and we're aura farming, we build up our aura, what's in your IAM game status window? What pops up? You have your strength, intelligence, vitality, agility, and each one of these correspond to something. Feel free, put in the chat 1, 2, 3, or 4. And Phani, you could go first. What do you pick as your top priority item?
I think security knowledge for me. I'm always trying to figure out like what's happening, what's changing, what are the new threat landscapes. Maybe there's overlap here, but I'm always trying to learn like, hey, what's the new service? What are different offerings that can simplify people's use of security and get them going along faster? So 2 for me.
All right, we have 2. Russ, what do you like?
I feel like this one's kind of obvious for me, vitality, but I also think that strength and policy writing is extremely important. Just using our last discussion as an example, like being able to say, I don't know, create a resource control policy that, has a source organization account ID, to try to prevent those sorts of confused deputy issues. So I think that policy writing is very underrated.
Yes, and that's where I was leaning as well. Number one, the strength of writing policies and kind of crafting them from the beginning so that they're strong and that they fit where you want to go within your organization. Because oftentimes, if you do, let's say, the agility with the quick fixes, you often have to come back to fix the quick fix. That's usually what we see. And usually the quick fix is harder to undo because something's already in production. It's up and running. Oh, this was certified. We have app developers on and so on and so forth. So all different items. So as we continue on, feel free to put 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat. But I think on the topic of just identifying our game status, I think this leads us to a really good idea of getting into, let's say, I would say a side quest. Because as SideQuest legend has it, I was trying to do the announcer voice, but one day, maybe after episode 100, I'll get it perfectly. But for you, first time joiners, the art of security side quest portion of our show is delving into, let's say, customer experience stories that we like to put in with a lens of curiosity and wonder as we do deal with the nuanced situations that apply to people. And I say all that in one word because it's very important. And what else is important? It's digging into the SideQuest board itself. So we have a SideQuest board. We have our 3 individuals with 1 aura farmer on the panel. I am not going to point at specifically who it is, but we know from the aura that they're radiating. So the SideQuest board is essentially a board that demonstrates, hey, we have some users that are not authenticated. We have an AWS environment. What is the path that we are supposed to take in order to secure said environment? So when we look at this, we have to set a background story, or origin story, some may say. So pretend from our last conversation, our last side quest, there's a security architect that's new, that they've worked with a nonprofit, managing a complex amount of multi-account AWS environments, but also dealing with the other side of having just a bunch of users within a nonprofit, because you have users coming and going and asking for missions, different projects, different, visions that maybe they don't know how to carry out. So if you're that security architect, you have all of these users and you have your AWS environment, they're just accessing it. This seems a little bit too close for comfort without some authentication method. So we have to start to think about, with that context in mind, what is the strongest identity weapon to put into place? But before we get to the specific scenario, I would pose to Phani, what's your strongest weapon when it comes to identity within an organization?
This is not even close. It's identity center for sure. I spent so much time in it. It just it allows me to do everything, access everything I need, put everything in a single place. Has logging and monitoring and observability built in, and you can do fun stuff like skim and federation, if you consider that fun.
Yeah, of course. The audience we're talking to, and yeah, it's funny because once we have that, we turn these type of users into authenticated users. Right? I think that's one of the main items is we want to make sure people are authenticated in the right method, whether you're using something like Cognito or Identity Center or something else. You want to make sure that you have visibility in who's accessing your AWS environment. You also have controls. So I pose to you, if we bump this up, let's put it over here for now. And let's put our environment over here because this is a side quest and we like to go about things in an interesting way, interesting perspective. So that's currently the path. We go into our AWS environment from our authenticated user, but there may be other things that we have to take into consideration. Like what other security services? What are the pieces of data that we have to have in place? I know we talked about Identity Center, but I think we also mentioned IAM because it's IAM, right? It's built in. So the next piece is if we have identity sprawl, we have a bunch of users trying to access our environment. They're authenticated, but this is where we get into the advanced conversations. How do we accurately know who is going in and out of our environment or who's leaving our environment, let's say?
I can tell you, it's logs and it's CloudTrail. That's something definitely to turn on, so you can and you can also review this in CloudWatch, but definitely have logging enabled, so you can see what people are doing and you can trace it back and fix anything if you need to.
Yeah, definitely that. So we have, let's say, CloudTrail logs in the environment with our identity, and we would say we have a couple of items in the chat. So yes, the bucket, the first bucket, yes, and I also laugh because this is a fun way to go about going on a side quest. That's what side quests are supposed to be. They're supposed to be fun, and you're supposed to learn. So as we go through this piece, we have our authenticated user, we have our CloudTrail logs. So I think another portion that we need to consider is we're getting logs. I think guard duty, face up in detective mode, I would say. As you start to go through this and understand, I know we're talking about identity, but we also have to think about the whole target state security strategy, right? Because hey, we have IAM in place, but what happens if somebody tries to access something that they shouldn't be? What happens if MFA isn't, enabled, turned on, rotated, whatever the case may be? And I know that it's tough to see up there, but we're starting to get into config and the config portion of the house. So the question I have is, if we identified our strongest identity weapon, and we have to consider all these different pieces like tech debt, right? Because as you're starting to get in these conversations, we talked about how do we get to a place of not having to retrofit stuff, right? That's that tech debt for legacy systems that become legacy because, hey, it'll be a lot of work to fix that. So the question that I pose next is, when you think, and I'll start with Russ, what is your biggest identity management boss battle? If we're looking at laying out things, right? You're trying to gain aura, you have your identity weapon in hand. Where do you go next?
Yeah, I think this would be more of just like the complexity of it. So it's just scaling and bringing this, exactly what we're seeing right here, to like the enterprise level.
Yes, I would agree with that, because that is the main item. Is as you start out, we talked about a nonprofit starts to grow, it starts to accelerate. Now you have more users and people to deal with, and to MN's standpoint, you start to think about SCPs and IAM boundaries, networking, things of that nature. You start to say, hey, we need a nice dashboard, but thank you. And also, how do we organize this? Well, we leverage stuff like Identity Center, like what Phani was saying. We implement, let's say, automated access reviews, establish permission boundaries. But we can use things outside of these tools. And one of those pieces, which I think we're going to talk about, that I have to hit the good old pause game button on because we have to jump out because side quests are important because they go into nuances. But we can also come back to the place of, hey, how do we put something practical into place? How do we talk about it or speak about it, depending on which way you heard it these days? So, Phani, what is something practical we can attribute to this?
It's easy to turn on logs and have protection enabled. So guard duty in CloudTrail, a couple of checkboxes will give you some reactive controls to basically make sure that you have some security posture in place. Obviously, we always recommend proactive, simplify it from the get-go. But in the event that you can't do that, check a couple of boxes in CloudTrail and guard duty, and that can give you a lot more than nothing.
I always like a lot more than nothing. That's always that's always something. When I go to the ice cream parlor, I'm like, just give me a lot more than nothing.
Are you going to the Turkish one? Because they're always messing with me, man.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
they really do be giving you nothing.
I always love seeing those videos. I was like, I got to practice that. But when we speak about from the governance standpoint, and I think we could jump into it. There's one tool in particular, right, Phani, that we want to talk about and kind of delve into.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I kind of get into it, I'll maybe preface it and kind of lead off in what you talked about. What is my biggest boss battle? It's compliance and regulation, right? Like from a technical perspective, I can tell you what's yes or no, what's true or false, what has a value or what's a null. But compliance, especially in the regulated fields like FedRAMP, like SOC, this is where you can start to see interpretation start to creep into these controls, and that can kind of make it a little bit difficult to navigate and understand. Like, hey, what do I need? What's the thing? We have several options available for that as well. Config, as Tristan mentioned, there's conformance packs that help you drive towards a specific regime, like FedRAMP, like NIST 800. But compliance is boss battle. One of the things that they talk about in compliance is governance. In the identity space, governance is understanding who has access to what are they doing with that access, right? And so that you have to know this if you're a big financial firm or if you're a big pharmaceutical or insurance firm, and you have to report what PHI data you might have access to or you're giving access to people to. So you have to actually report all of these things and show them, and also be able to understand who's using your access and who's not. So that's the concept of governance. One tool to help you in this in AWS is called Access Analyzer. That's what I'm showing on the screen. This is the IAM dashboard, and you can set up analyzers in your account to understand what type of access is either unused or what type of access is external. So this type of report can tell you, hey, I have all these roles and policies set up. Is somebody actually using them? And if so, are they needed? You can also look at who's coming from outside of the AWS account. So the identity and access management service is really flexible. It can allow you to integrate a lot of services inside AWS and outside. But that can also create some trouble for you. So here's a service, AWS IAM Access Analyzer, that can tell you what type of service is either unused or external. You set up a couple of analyzers, and then it goes and looks at that. So I'm showing you a sample of that on the screen, where you can see I have unused roles and permissions. So I've created these roles and permissions in my account, but I'm not really using them. And Access Analyzer is saying, hey, these are unused. You should go clean these up. I have a bunch. Don't do this. This is a demo account. But ideally, this would be 0 or a single, right? And so you can do the same thing with external access. Hey, what kind of access have I given to outside accounts? And then also see if they're using it or not. So that's Access Analyzer. It can help you with your governance requirements. especially if they're related to compliance or other regulated requirements.
Yeah, and that's definitely a big driver of a lot of large scale enterprises and organizations. Like, how do I meet these requirements? How do I know, right? That evidence component. So I think IAM Access Analyzer is a powerful tool, especially when you implement it into a pipeline or things of that nature, right? Because you start to go down the route of, hey, we already took care of this. How do we get to that automated compliance checking component, right? And IAM Access Analyzer, then you can also start to talk about other things like OPA and a whole bunch of other items. But you want some building blocks that you can start off with. And Access Analyzer, if you wanted to go down a path, definitely one of the paths to go down.
And I will plus one on Insure's comment from the chat. Control Tower can help set up some of the governance for you, and also enable configuration rules to understand this automatically. And I'll also plus one his other comment about there's a lot of tools at your disposal, right? That's where we talked about defense in depth. But to Tristan's point, don't go it alone. That's why we're here. Do not go alone. We are here. Take a partner with you. We have revival potions. We have other things that can that can definitely aid in the battle.
Yes. So that's when we have to come and say, hey, we have to be serious for a second while we're laughing. Hey guys, like and subscribe and follow us as we start to talk about all these different areas that we can delve into, like IAM Access Analyzer, ways that we can help within our organization of just saying, hey, there's some tools out there. There's some things that you can leverage within your environment, right? That helps you to level up a little bit, if we wanted to use those terms. So as we get into the conversation, and Tolo says the eyes, right? Yeah, it's the eyes as we go deeper and say, hey, identity, and then we come back out. But the other thing after you like and subscribe and all that good stuff is you want to think about what's your own IAM rank? What's your own identity? I think that's an important part to consider, right? So if we were taking an aura into account, are you an E rank? Are you C rank? B, A, S? Where, hey, this is the first step is just identifying. You're like, hey, I know nothing about IAM, or I know everything, or I can learn to, learn a little bit more. So feel free, put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the chat as you start to think about this. And this is where you start to think of, hey, where am I on this list? And it's interesting because as an AWS professional, you're like, hey, I'm S rank. But there's new things that come out, like the RCPs, and you're just like, oh, am I still S rank? Or do I have to delve a little bit deeper into that and come up with a couple more demos and stuff like that? Right? What are your guys' thoughts?
I will stay humble and not comment, because I think if I did, then I would have to choose high. No, but I spend a lot of time in identity space, so I love identity. Like I said, I could talk about it for weeks, so I won't worry with all that.
Well, there's a reason you're on the show. You can go ahead and say it.
Yeah. If you don't notice the aura coming off of Phani when we talk about identity, like you literally see it coming through his glasses. It's just the aura component.
That's what happens when you get
you like bring it up on your face and then it flashes.
Yeah, that's what we like to see, right?
This is what you unlock when you get to the S tier.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so you start to think about all these different things, and if you're not S rank or you're not A rank or B or C, you may think to yourself, how do I get to that level? How do I achieve the next level of rank? And how do I kind of, go from E rank to a little bit of, building your aura? And that's where a knowledge quest comes in. And what is a knowledge quest? Well, it's essentially articles, workshops, items that you like to grab after your 5 a.m. run, right? You want to take and beverage of choice, coffee, tea, water, all that good stuff. And you sit down and say, hey, I want to read or go through different things. And that's where the knowledge quests come in. And today's knowledge quest,
AKA homework.
Yeah. See, exactly. Russ went to the seminar. So when we start to think about building aura, we want to think and break it down by levels, right? We want to say, hey, I'm an E rank, so I want to go on a couple of level 100. I want to, collect some courage when it comes to identity. So level 100 items, what do we start to think about? Well, we start to think about articles and blog posts and things of that nature. You may say, which ones? Well, we have a couple of them that we could go on. So I would say the first one, if I were to not freeze, is this one. IAM tutorials. Nice, easy place to start out to collect your courage, to build out your courage and start building your aura. Right? So you think about, hey, to your questions, like, how do I create a customer managed policy? What is ABAC? All these good things. You can start to click around and read and dive into it. And then after you dive into, what are the best practices? These are level 100 tasks that you can go through and start to understand the different components and ask yourself questions of, hey, require human users to use Federation with identity provided to access AWS temp credentials. If that sounds like a whole lot of nothing to you, that's okay. Delve in, take it step by step. And I like to say break it down to the ones and zeros because that's where everybody starts. Everybody starts at an E rank and levels up their aura until they're Phani level. But level 200 starts to get a little bit interesting because you start to go from reading to, hey, how do I implement? How do I start to, let's say, test policies? And that's when you start to get into, hey, let me simulate these policies, whether it be in my own environment or using something like the IAM policy simulator. So, Russ, Phani, how often do you use the policy simulator?
I can't say not much. I think I rely more on managed policies from AWS, so I can try to offload some of that heavy lifting. But I'd say probably once or twice a year.
Yeah, see, Phani went to the seminar too. See, but Russ, from your side, how often do you use policy simulator?
I use it regularly, especially if I'm going to create a new or help a customer create a new policy. I'm going to, try to validate it as much as possible before I, hand it over to them and say, do this thing. So I definitely use it a lot, regularly.
And that is the interesting dichotomy because you see both ends of the spectrum. Right? So when you're thinking about how do I approach this, there's no one right answer. There's different ways to approach items, and it's based on your own, let's say, organizational strategy, right? Do you start out, hey, we're just going to use the managed policies. We want to offload. Maybe I'm that one security architect for the nonprofit that I don't have time to make so many custom policies. I just need something that I could put into place that fits our structure because we're not that complicated. Maybe we just have a couple of services, things of that nature. Or maybe you're retrofitting. Maybe you have some of that tech debt that we were talking about. And to Russ's approach, where it's like, hey, I'm coming from IR standpoint of, hey, we have to fix some stuff. So I'm going to test out a bunch of custom policies and go through all those different items. Right. So as we continue and also say hi and Wielder the Wilder, I get that reference. But as you start to go through and understand the next level of how do you get to the sage power? How do you start to go through these pieces? Well, sage power is, all right, now let's put IAM Access Analyzer into a pipeline. How do we do that? How do we come up with a flow that fits my own organization? And one of the ways to do that is a workshop. Something nice, simple to go through. It's a guided tour before you go off the rails. Right? So how do I start to think about identity within my organization? And what are some of the tools I can introduce at every step of the way? So I think those are some good thoughts. And speaking of thoughts, Phani, you mentioned IAM Access Analyzer and starting to go down the path of understanding with your great sage and aura building wisdom. So what are your recommendations from IAM Access Analyzer? If you could, I guess, tell somebody who's just starting out with identity why you should use IAM Access Analyzer and how you should use it, where do you go?
Yeah, I think where I see it helping definitely a lot is uh, someone who's just maybe getting started with AWS or got started with AWS but didn't spend a lot of time thinking about identity and organization in the beginning. They might have uh, identity sprawl at a given point. So they might have multiple accounts. They might have cross role accounts that they're doing. I see a lot of cross role accounts. So they'll set up like one username and then they'll do a trust to another role in another account. That's definitely useful, right? Like there's those types of things. Those are roles usually, and it's not users or groups. So people will say, "Hey, I see the user, I see the role. I've cleaned up my users, I've cleaned up my groups," but they might have not looked at the role. And so that's definitely uh, something that I can clear. It's clear value. You can just get in there, turn on external access. You can see who else is given access to you from outside of the AWS account and quickly resolve that. So that if it's like some random AWS account that you don't recognize, like you should be taking action pretty soon, right away.
Yeah, the one that says danger, don't delete. Yeah, those are ones you definitely don't do, right? Those are. I mean, it's always funny from the IR standpoint, and maybe Russ, you've seen this before. It's just like it'll say, "Don't delete," very important, or something along those lines, and it's like, of course we won't delete this, right? And then you look at it, it's just like wild cards everywhere, just access policies, access everything. Yeah, so.
It's pretty common.
Yeah, yes, I do.
I saw all of it just flash before Russ's eyes right now.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Glazed over for a second.
So I guess one of the last questions we can do a 1-minute drill on is how do you farm your IAM experience? And I open this to both of you. So how do you farm IAM experience?
You want to go first, Russ?
No.
Okay. Oh well. Practice makes perfect. Practice, practice, practice. So if you've seen enough JSON errors, you'll know when the comma is missing or the indent is missing. So that I think if you're just talking about core controls and policies and just kind of understanding, hey, am I looking at this policy right? That's just practice. Like if you can work on some of those policy creation, you'll quickly get to a point where you can quickly evaluate what a policy is about and say, hey, is this good? Is this not? What is going on here? So don't be scared about big policies, but do some aura farming in the sense that work with those policies, create some, put them into use. The other thing is think about like different use cases and integrations. How are people actually using this? Where's the identity coming from? How's it getting used? So if you can really tie in like that, the end-to-end life cycle of like how is someone starting an authentication session and then how are they getting authorization and finally on how are they logging off and getting offboarded, that clearly helps you identify like where's the whole flow, what things are talking to each other, and having that overall big picture helps a lot.
Definitely a lot of good points. Russ, your turn.
So I think that just in general, I've been thinking throughout this episode of some previous concepts that we went over. So, when Phani was discussing earlier about, as you get more advanced, you need to simplify things as much as possible, which we kind of went over in the security automation episodes is, as things get, more complex, you really need to simplify. And then the other thing that had me thinking of a previous episode, pretty much totally slipped my mind now. So,
No worries.
But
there's one thing.
I mean,
there's one thing that didn't slip your mind. Just
but
for
there's one thing that never
seconds.
slipped my mind. Create an incident response plan.
See, had to say it, right? Because we're running out of time, and there's one thing you want to take away is what Russ said. Create an incident response plan.
Please and thank you.
Yes. And I would also say thank you to everybody who tuned in, right? That joined us on this journey of identity, especially learning how to farm, a little bit of identity aura with the sage himself, Phani. So thank you, Phani, for coming on the show. And I would say come back next week as we talk about maybe something from a container security variety. So we'll leave off on this episode with a close-up as we look away from the camera because we have the aura to do so now. So thank you. Until next time, take care. Right?
See ya.
All right.